The St. John of Damascus Orthodox Educational Initiative presents the Damascene Podcast.
Synod from the Syrian on the Lord, section 24. Accordingly, our Lord placed a word of conciliation at the beginning of his speech, that by conciliation he might pacify the Pharisee, into whose mind discord and division had entered. He was the physician who ranged his cures against the things hurtful to men. Our Lord then shot forth this word as an arrow, and set in the head of it conciliation as the barb. And he anointed it with love, that soothes the members, so that when it flew into him, who was full of discord, he was at once changed from discord to harmony. For straightway, upon hearing that humble voice of our Lord, saying, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee, that secret despiser returned his answer, Say on, Lord. For the sweet voice entered his bitter mind, and begot of it pleasant fruit. For he who before this voice was one that secretly despised, after this voice became one that openly honored. For humility, by its sweet utterance, subdues even its adversaries into rendering it honor. For it is not over its friends that humility tests its power, but over its enemies it exhibits its victories. Section 25. Thus the heavenly King arrayed himself in armor of humility, and so conquered the bitter one, and drew from him a good answer as a sure pledge of victory. This is the armor concerning which Paul said, that by it we humble the loftiness that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. For Paul had received the proof of it in himself. For as he had been warring in pride, but was conquered in humility, so is to be conquered every lofty thing which exalteth itself against this humility. For Saul was journeying to subdue the disciples with hard words, but the master of the disciples subdued him with a humble word. For when he, to whom all things are possible, manifested himself to him, giving up all things else, he spoke to him in humility alone, that he might teach us that a soft tongue is more effectual than all things else against hard thoughts. For neither threats nor words of terror were heard by Paul, but weak words, not able to avenge themselves. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? But the words which were thought not even capable of avenging themselves were found to be taking vengeance by drawing him away from the Jews and making him a goodly vessel. He who was full of the bitter will of the Jews was then filled with the sweet preaching of the cross. When he was filled with the bitterness of the crucifiers, in his bitterness he made havoc of the churches. But when he was filled with the sweetness of the crucified, he embittered the synagogues of the crucifiers. Our Lord then strove with humble voice with him who had been warring against his churches with hard bonds. Thus Saul, who had been binding the disciples with bitter chains, was bound with pleasant persuasions, that he might not again cast the disciples into bonds, since he was bound by the crucified, who puts to silence evil voices, whom all they that were set against him could not bind or injure. But when Paul ceased from binding the disciples, he himself was bound with chains by the persecutors. But when he was bound with chains, he loosed the bonds of idolatry by his bonds. Section 26. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? He who had conquered his persecutors in the world below, and ruled over the angels in the world above, spoke from above with humble voice. And he, who while he was upon earth, had denounced 10 woes against his crucifiers, when he was in heaven, did not denounce even one woe against Saul, his persecutor. Now our Lord denounced woe to his crucifiers, that he might teach his disciples not to be dismayed by his murderers. But our Lord spoke in humility from heaven, that in humility the heads of his church might speak. And if anyone should say, Wherein did our Lord speak humbly with Paul? For lo, the eyes of Paul were grievously smitten. Let him know that it was not from our merciful Lord that this chastisement proceeded, who spoke those words in humility, but from the vehement light that vehemently shone forth there. And this light did not strike Paul by way of retribution on account of his deeds, but on account of the vehemence of his rays. Its rays it hurt him. As he also said, when I arose, I could discern nothing for the glory of the light. But if that light was glorious, O Paul, how did the glorious light become a blinding light to thee thyself? The light was that which, according to its nature, illuminates above, but contrary to its nature, it shone forth below. When it illumined above, it was delightful, but when it shone forth below, it was blinding. For the light was both grievous and pleasant. It was grievous and violent towards the eyes of the flesh, and it was pleasant and delightful to those who are fire and spirit. Section 27. For I saw a light from heaven that excelled the sun, and its light shone upon me. So then mighty rays streamed forth without moderation, and were poured upon feeble eyes, which moderate rays refresh. For lo, the sun also in measure assists the eyes, but beyond measure and out of measure it injures the eyes. And it is not by way of vengeance and wrath that it smites them. For lo, it is the friend of the eyes and beloved of the eyeballs. And this is a marvel, while with its gentle luster it befriends and assists the eyes. Yet by its vehement rays it is hostile to and injures the eyeballs. But if the sun which is here below, and of kindred nature with the eyes that are here below, yet injures them in vehemence and not in anger, in its proper force and not in wrath, how much more should the light that is from above, akin to the things that are above, by its vehemence injure a man here below, who has suddenly gazed upon that which is not akin to his nature? For since Paul might have been injured by the vehemence of this sun to which he was accustomed if he gazed upon it, not according to custom, how much more should he be injured by the glory of that light to which his eyes never had been accustomed? For behold, Daniel also was melted and poured out on every side before the glory of the angel, whose vehement brightness suddenly shone upon him. And it was not because of the angel's wrath that his human weakness was melted, just as it is not on account of the wrath or hostility of fire that wax is melted before it, but on account of the weakness of the wax it cannot keep firm and stand in presence of fire. When then the two approach one another, the power of the fire by its quality prevails, but the weakness of the wax, on the other hand, is brought lower even than its former weakness. Section 28. But the majesty of the angel was manifested in itself. The weakness of flesh in itself could not endure, for my inward parts were turned into corruption. But yet men see men, their fellows, and faint before them. Yet it is not by their bright splendor that they are moved, but by their harsh will. For servants are terrified by the wrath of their masters, and those that are judged tremble through fear of their judges. But this did not befall Daniel on account of threatening or anger from the angel, but on account of his terrible nature and prevailing brightness. For it was not with threatening the angel came to him. For if he had come with threatening, how could a mouth full of threatening become full of peace, when it came saying, Peace be unto thee, thou man of desire? Thus that mouth, that was a fountain of thunderings, for the voice of his words was like the voice of many hosts, that voice became to him a fountain teeming with and containing peace. And when the voice reached the terrified ears, which were athirst for the encouraging greeting of peace, there was opened and poured out for Daniel a draught of peace. And by the angel's later word of peace, those ears were encouraged which had been terrified by his former voice first. For he said, Let my Lord speak, because I have been strengthened. But because in that heart-moving vision the fiery angel was about to announce nothing concerning him, the Lord on this account, that majesty of the angel, was forward to give the salutation of peace to the lowliness of the prophet, that by the gladdening salutation which that awful majesty gave, the dread should be removed which lay on the mind of the lowliness and that was terrified.